On this episode of Locked On Lightning, we're continuing our player reviews, and today we're taking a look at the curious case of Nick Perbix.
You're Locked On Lightning, your daily podcast on the Tampa Bay Lightning, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And welcome to another episode of Locked On Lightning, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, Adam Danker. Thank you for joining me on this episode of Locked On Lightning. On today's episode of Locked On Lightning, we're continuing our player reviews, and we're taking a look at Nick Perbix. Where does he fit into the Lightning's immediate plans? Can he be moved in the offseason, as well as expectations if he does start next season with the Lightning? What are those expectations? Do we have any at all? Before we jump into any of those questions, please go ahead and subscribe to the podcast. Give us a follow wherever podcasts are distributed in audio form. We're also available on YouTube. Subscribe to our channel there. Hit that notification button so as soon as the newest episode drops, you'll be notified. So, Nick Perbix, this was an episode that I tried to really kind of put off for a while now. I wanted to get more of the positive cases or positive storylines that Lightning players are having this year. And Nick Perbix, I think we could all agree, has been very much of a controversial topic for Lightning fans to kind of debate about and to discuss, I think, almost on a night-to-night basis. And I think that when we look at Nick Perbix, and it's weird saying this because there was so much hype, if you remember, going back to his first couple of months with the Lightning. You really thought this guy was going to be something special offensively, kind of be a good yin to Victor Hedman's yang, and that hasn't been the case at all. And even when defensemen don't score or put up points, you could always kind of, with some of them, hang their hat on, or at least hope that you could hang your hat on them playing good defense. And that really hasn't been the case for Nick Perbix. It's kind of been the opposite, if we're being brutally honest here. And it's weird that we're talking about Nick Perbix in a negative light, considering if you look at his stats from his 2 years in Tampa Bay, his first year, 22-23, he had 5 goals, 20 points, and he played 69 games that year. Let's just throw that out. 23-24, he plays 77 games. He scores 2 goals, but he has 22 assists, putting him 4 over in points of what he had the previous year. And yet here we're talking about, like I said, a very controversial topic of conversation, but also just a very odd case study because his points actually increased, yet we're more dissatisfied with the way he has played over the last couple of years than really we were. I mean, and a lot of it has to do with the fact that he has really not played good defense. I mean, yeah, he scores points here and there, but you don't see him kind of being a game breaker really on any side of the ice. I mean, he does here and there maybe make one decent play a game, but when the Lightning have struggled the way they did this year defensively, and at times even offensively, it doesn't, in my opinion, really make a difference. And I don't think it makes a difference for any other Lightning fan. And I think part of it also has to do with the fact that there's clearly some sort of favoritism there. And not saying that this is specific to Tampa Bay. This is all across the league. There is a favoritism 100% with Cooper when it comes to Perbix. I think that we could agree that Perbix, to a certain degree, has gotten a little bit more chances than maybe some other players on this team have. I don't know if it's maybe Cooper thinks that that really at the end of the day, we're going to possibly see that level of play that we saw from him early on in his rookie season. The thing that obviously kind of stood out to everyone that season was the fact that, he had a level of maturity that you didn't really see from many defensemen their first year in the league. A lot of that had to do with him playing in college and being a little bit older than most defensemen would stereotypically be in their rookie years. And I think that's what kind of made some of us fall in love with him a little faster. And then on the other side of that, also fall out of love with him when his play declined. And now that we see that the mood has soured, now that we see kind of him for what he is, because, we're not talking about a guy who's 21, 22, looking to kind of still mold him because he's still very raw. This is a guy who is going to be 26 on June 15th, a guy, a defenseman who we've spoken about numerous times on this podcast when it comes to defensemen, that these guys age a lot faster than your stereotypical NHL player. 28 might be 32 and 32 might be 34 or 36, 37, depending on the player. And especially when the Lightning are in a situation that they are very much up against it with the cap, you don't have time really, especially when you want to be a cup contender or get back to that, is you don't have time to have these pet projects. And I think that that's a nice way of describing Nick Perbix. He's really just a project. And maybe if he were to be on some other team, a team that maybe is middle of the road or kind of in the middle of a rebuild, that is when you say, okay, we're going to work with this guy. We're gonna figure out really what the best way to use him for. And it seemed like, especially towards the end of the season and in the playoffs, the Lightning were they washed their hands of that. He played in 2 games, and I think that shows a lot. I think that shows us where the Lightning are now with Nick Perbix, that they're if they haven't already, that was the first kind of signs that they're going to be moving on from him possibly. And I think when we talk about the salary cap, when we talk about what the Lightning need to do to get back to cup contenders, we spoke about obviously addressing the defensive issues with this team. They go out and get Ryan McDonough, but his contract puts you in another hole that you got to dig yourself out again. And we could talk about that as the offseason progresses on, because that will very well be a topic of conversation, because it looks like now you have money to sign Stamkos. Boom. You get Ryan McDonough, and now you're kind of back to square one, if not worse off in terms of money. And now bringing McDonough back to Tampa Bay, that kind of pushes Perbix even more out of the picture, especially with his contract, $1.125 million. I think we could all agree that he hasn't played up to that. He has not whatsoever played up to the value of that contract. And like I said, I'm not going to kill a defenseman unless, they're Cal McCarr or, a high level defenseman that can score a bunch of goals and score a lot of points, a Roman Josi. any other defenseman in the league outside of the conversation, you could put other guys if you want in that conversation. I'm not going to kill a defenseman for not scoring points, but at the end of the day, if you're not playing defense to at least even it out, not to be harsh, but what are you good for? And that's how I look at it. He's not definitely worth the $1 million. He may not even be worth right now $800,000. And that's really what the Lightning are going to have to figure out in the coming weeks, especially as the offseason comes fully around when the playoffs are over. How do you move on from Nick Perbix? I don't think it helps anyone whatsoever to just have him sit in Syracuse and, maybe become a career minor leaguer. Maybe that's not something that would be the smart decision long-term and just allow him to play out his contract. I don't think that's something that is really feasible for the Lightning. I think, get value back what you can, even if it's not ideal. And we'll talk about that in the next segment. What is his value? If there's any at all. We'll talk about that coming up in just a little bit. Let me know in the comments below. I mean, this is a very, it's a very touchy subject when you're evaluating players and where they fit into the team going forward, not only for the immediate season coming up, but for future seasons. But that's the reality of professional sports, and even, in jobs, sometimes you got to make the tough decisions and got to be a little harsh about it. So we'll talk about that coming up in just a little bit. But first, we're going to talk about our first sponsor on today's show, and that is our friends over at eBay Motors. Now, passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for with eBay Guaranteed Fit, and your part is guaranteed to fit your ride or die every time or your money back, because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. So keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit, only available to U.S. customers. So as always, I want to thank you all for making us your first listen of the day. If you haven't already done so, please go ahead and subscribe to the podcast. Give us a follow wherever podcasts are distributed in audio form. We're also available on YouTube. Subscribe to our channel there. If you want to hit us up on our social media pages, LO_Lightning on Twitter, LockedOn_Lightning on Instagram, reach out to me at DankyDank, DENKYD8NK, and also follow my other work at boltsbythebay.com. So it's difficult, and I think it's also a conversation that needs to consistently be had, because, that's something that has been talked about with Lightning fans really since even when the playoffs were going on, even during their series against Florida, and even before then. We always have Lightning fans on social media or in the comments section on our YouTube page, whatever the case, whatever platform. We always have you guys reach out, and I love the back and forth, so keep that up. But we always have you guys and gals reaching out saying, trade this guy, get rid of him. We talked about it a lot with Eric Chernak. And we're going to talk about it now with Nick Perbix. My thing is, and even with Tanner Janelle, my thing is when you're saying, get rid of this guy, he doesn't do anything or whatever, you realize you're kind of hurting your point there by saying that, because I'm all for making moves if that's really something that needs to be done. And in this case, yes, I like I said at the end of the last segment, I don't think that it would be beneficial to anybody, Lightning or Nick Perbix, if he is just one of those guys that periodically gets called up from Syracuse from time to time to fill in here or there, especially with the amount of money that he's making. And, there might be some teams that might say, hey, why don't we take a chance on this guy? He's a cheap option. He's got NHL experience. He could help some of the younger guys, stuff like that. And that's something that could very well happen. You know, the Lightning could get lucky and a Columbus Blue Jackets or an Anaheim Ducks or a Utah team might hit up the Lightning and be like, listen, we know you may not want Perbix, so we're going to take him off your hands. But the question I always ask all of you, especially if you're an everyday listener, you already know what I'm going to say here. All right, let's trade this guy, but let's have the conversation. Don't just say, boom, I want him gone. Let's trade him. And that's it. No, you have to give me more than that. And I'm going to make that a requirement going forward for all of you. You know, when you make trade demands for a player on this team, any player on this team, I want you to put below or somewhere in your message or comment, what realistically do you think is going to come back? I don't want to know the team. I don't need to know specific player names, but say, hey, for example, in this conversation, Nick Perbix, if I were to trade him in the offseason, we get a 7th round pick. We get a very low prospect, you know, a depth chart AHL player, a third line defenseman AHL player, whatever, something like that. With, if you want to throw retained salary or whatever the case may be, go ahead. But that's what I think when we're looking at the Nick Perbix trade dilemma or whatever you would like to call it. We got to talk about his value and really what is his value. Yes, he does put up points, but no team is going to want to pick up a defenseman that really does not really do much. And that's the thing. I've always spoken about it on this show about how the best defenseman is the one that makes 2 or 3 very good plays per game defensively. Takes care of the puck, plays good along the boards, occasionally puts up points. And that's something that I think we could all agree that we didn't get from any defenseman this year, for the most part, consistently, at least. And you look down the pecking order of the Lightning defensive pairs, and if you want to go back off of the player review episode I put out last or previously, I think it was Hayden Fleury. I might be wrong. But I think that with Hayden Fleury, you know, you get a cheaper option. You get someone who knows the system, who, you know, you're not expecting them to put up points, and he's a solid defensive player. He's not going to be an every night player, but he's an option there, especially if you're bringing guys up from Syracuse. And that's the other thing that you got to throw in to this Nick Perbix equation. You get rid of that $1 million. You get a 7th round pick from whoever. It could be Utah. I don't know. I don't know if we could even count Utah as kind of like that team who's going to take on salary anymore. New ownership might want to change how things are out there. Different, you know. Might have to look at Anaheim. Still not sure. They're still kind of developing. Ottawa, maybe. Who knows? Columbus might be in play, I think. You know, Columbus might be that new team that is willing to take on salary. But really, at the end of the day, you know, realistic value for Nick Perbix is probably a 7th round pick, which I wouldn't be mad about. 7th round pick, maybe 2025, because you're definitely not going to get a 7th round pick for 2024. 2025, even 26 if you want to push it that far. Just because everybody knows if you're trying to move this guy, it's a salary dump. That's all it is. And at the same time, what I started to say is that for those of you that want to hold on to Nick Perbix, do you really want to hold on him and take up a a roster spot that could be used for a young defenseman coming out of Syracuse? Is that what you really want to do? I mean, the time is now to develop these defensemen to kind of find a place for them, because the Lightning do have good quality defensemen. There's a lot of options down there that only if this team is willing to give these guys a chance, I think it could work out. Obviously, the big name is Max Crozier. And I think that really this decision that the Lightning will need to make on Nick Perbix, other name also Declan Carlisle, who I just really like. I like how he played in the playoffs this year up in Syracuse. And I think that at the end of the day, the decision needs to be made sooner rather than later in order to just, because the longer you wait, like we saw, I mean, classic example in Lightning history is the Tanner Jeannot trade. The Lightning waited till last minute to make that trade, and look how it turned out for the Lightning. The longer you wait, the more you have time to sit on it. The more time you have to sit on it, the more doubts you have. The more you second guess yourself. And I think we've seen enough out of Nick Perbix to know that he isn't a long-term solution. And the Lightning, I think, really, what we spoke about on our Stanley Cup window episode, he really only has this team only maybe has 3 to 4 years before we start to see, obviously players on this team kind of age out. And I mean, the Hedmans, Stamkos, if he comes back. But that makes it even more imperative that you need to make moves now in order to put yourself in a good situation to be a cup contender. And it really starts with guys like, Nick Perbix chipping away at this salary cap. So let me know in the comments below. I mean, yeah, his value, I think, is just, it might jump. I don't think it's at a place right now where you could really get much back for him. It might change depending on what we see in the offseason with the free agent market and all that stuff. So stay tuned. We could be very well having a conversation where the Lightning could get a more recent draft pick than something 7 in the future. Who knows? Crazier things have happened. So let me know in the comments below. And coming up in just a little bit, we're going to wrap things up with, if he is in a Tampa Bay Lightning uniform, what are our expectations for him in 2024-25? But first, we're going to wrap things up with our last sponsor on the show, and that is our friends over at FanDuel. Now, it's winner take all time in the NBA and NHL, and FanDuel's giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and more. I am putting money on the Mavs just because I'm a New Yorker and I'm just really going to be petty about every bet I put in the NBA Finals. Mavs, Celtics, do not want to see Boston win an NBA Finals. For the playoffs, like I said, I put a future bet on the Rangers to win it all. That's not looking good right now. Out of the West, I also had Dallas coming out. That's not looking good at all either, with Edmonton going up 3-2 in that series last night. So I'm not saying listen to me about betting advice, but, you have plenty of chances to bet on anything and everything on FanDuel. So visit FanDuel.com/locked-on and make every playoff shot count. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So wrapping things up as we always do here on Locked On Lightning with our player reviews, we're talking about our expectations for next season. And as wishful as I am that Perbix will not be in Tampa Bay, not because I don't think he's a good person or anything like that, and I don't have any issue with him. I just think it would be better for this team long term or even next season to get to move on from him, the nicer way to put it. And I think that I wouldn't be surprised though either, just because like we stated at the beginning of this episode, how John Cooper really likes him, just gives him a ton of opportunities, and I really thought even I was a little surprised, I think, even after the season he had, that he even played 2 games in that series against Florida. I still that shows that, you know, as much as it looks like Cooper can't trust him, he's still willing to put him out there for whatever reason it might be. I don't know. He still think he maybe matches up better against certain players. Who knows? But I think if he is in Tampa Bay next season, the expectations, I think, safe to say, are going to be very low. I think that we will see him on the third line. If he's anywhere higher than the third line, I just think that at that point, all reason has really gone out the window at that point. Even then, I think that he will be scratched most of the games that he'll be on the roster. Ideally, I would like to keep him warm and have him in Syracuse and, you know, help out with some of the younger players. But same time, when a guy's making $1 million, it's just not a good look to have him in the AHL for him as well as the team. But even then, if you have him at the NHL level, you know, like I said, third line tops unless there's an injury, and even then, you move up Lilleberg or Crozer and just figure it out from there. I just, you know, if even if you have a line in which you have Perbix and Chernak on that third line at some point, I don't have a problem with that. You have Lilleberg with Sergei or Crozer with Sergei, or, you know, there's going to be, I think, a lot of interchangeable combinations with these defensive pairings where you don't really have to force yourself into a situation where you need to throw out Nick Perbix there. But if he does get any playing time, which I guarantee you, if he's on this team next year, he will. I just want to see good defense. I just want him to go out there and play like a guy who's still trying to make this team. And that's what we saw early on in his career, very early on. And I don't know if it was a change of attitude or misuse, and that has been a huge topic here when we're talking about reviews. A lot of players have been misused on this team. And yes, that does fall on the organization not being able to put the right players around, as well as the coaches in general, not just, you know, Cooper, but anyone being the voice of reason in the room and being like, listen, maybe we should try it this way. I think that could be a reason, but I just want to see a guy who plays 200 feet, mostly plays like a guy that is on the verge of really his career being over. And that's what you need to see out of him. I want to see him, you know, be more physical, because we don't see really more of anything from this guy. Yeah, he puts up the points and puts up the assists, and I don't have it in front of me right now, but I'm curious as to how many of those assists are really primary. If I had to guess, probably not a lot. And that doesn't do anything for me. You know, a defenseman, keeping a guy on a team, a defenseman who doesn't play defensively very well, doesn't score goals, puts up reasonable amount of points, but really, what effect does that really have on the team for the long term? Not much. You got to move on from that. And I just think that the only way he can redeem himself, like I said, is play solid defense. We've talked about the playoffs a lot here, to a certain degree on this podcast, and if you want to take notes in terms of, what kind of player we want to see from Nick Perbix, and I'm sure a lot of you are watching the playoffs right now. A guy like Nico Mikola from Florida doesn't score a lot of points, goes out there and is willing to hit anyone and everyone through the glass into the fifth row. Now, obviously, Perbix is not as physically gifted as him, but that intensity, we need to see that from him. And that's the only way he could stay on this team, in my opinion, going forward. So if he could have a season like that, just be a defensive spark plug, there'll always be a place on the Lightning for a guy like that. And the Lightning don't have that really. And if Nick Perbix wants to stay on this team and kind of redefine himself, that's the way to go. So really, that's my expectations for him going into the 24-25 NHL season. So let me know below in the comments, what are your feelings on this? And we'll be back on Monday to talk more about player reviews. As to who we're going to be talking about, not sure. But I can tell you on Bolt by the Bay, we'll be talking about Anthony Cirelli. We'll be talking about Tanner Jeannot. So keep an eye out for those articles as well coming up in the next couple of days. So in the meantime, that's been it for this episode of Locked On Lightning, part of Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, Adam Danker. I'll talk to you in the next one.